A lonely millionaire finds a little girl in a wheelchair, abandoned by the roadside on a rainy night. He decides to take her to his mansion, but what happens after her arrival unravels dark secrets and unexpected connections to his past. You won't believe this story. Thunder crackled across the sky as Alexander Morgan's Bentley glided through the winding road leading to his estate. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour, forcing him to slow down on the treacherous curves. At 55, he had grown accustomed to these solitary drives, finding solace in the rhythmic sound of rain against metal. His mansion, perched atop Somerset Hill, loomed in the distance like a silent sentinel. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain-slicked asphalt. Alexander's thoughts drifted to the board meeting earlier that day, where he had once again maintained his reputation as the cold-hearted titan of industry. Ice King, they called him behind his back. Let them talk. He had built his empire from nothing, and emotions had no place in business. A flash of movement caught his eye. There, at the edge of his high beam, something shifted. Alexander's foot eased off the accelerator, years of careful instincts taking over. As the car slowed, the shape became clearer. A wheelchair, its metal frame glinting in the rain. His heart skipped a beat as he realized it wasn't empty. A small figure sat there, drenched and shivering, barely visible beneath a soaked blue raincoat. Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His first instinct was to drive past. This wasn't his problem. He had learned the hard way that getting involved only led to complications, to pain. The memory of another rainy night. 12 years ago flashed through his mind. He pushed it away as he had done countless times before. The car rolled past the wheelchair, and Alexander watched in his rearview mirror as the small figure grew smaller. "Damn it," he muttered, hitting the brakes. The Bentley reversed smoothly until it drew level with the wheelchair. Alexander lowered the passenger window, rain immediately spattering the leather interior. "Are you—" he began, then stopped. The figure in the wheelchair was a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. Her face, pale and drawn, turned toward him with an expression that made his chest tighten. Not fear or desperation, but a quiet resignation that had no place on a child's features. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice gruffer than intended. The girl remained silent, water dripping from her raincoat onto the wheelchair's metal frame. Alexander noticed her hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. Lightning split. The sky followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. The girl flinched, and something in Alexander broke. Before he could second-guess himself, he was out of the car, his Italian shoes sinking into mud as he approached the wheelchair. "You can't stay out here," he said, more to himself than to her. "I have a house nearby. We'll call the authorities, find your family." The girl's only response was to clutch a worn backpack closer to her chest. Alexander awkwardly maneuvered the wheelchair toward his car, thankful that it was the kind that could fold. As he lifted the girl into the passenger seat, he was struck by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. The wheelchair went into the trunk, and soon they were moving again through the storm. The girl remained silent as the car climbed the hill toward Morgan Estate. Alexander stole glances at her, noting the way she stared straight ahead, her small hand still gripping that backpack, as if it contained all the secrets of the universe. Mrs. Henderson, his longtime housekeeper, was waiting at the door when they arrived, her usual stoic expression cracking at the sight of the rain-soaked pair. "Mr. Morgan?" she questioned, concern and curiosity warring in her voice. "She needs dry clothes and something warm to drink," Alexander said, carrying the girl inside. "And call Dr. Reynolds. Tell him it's urgent." As Mrs. Henderson hurried off, Alexander stood in his vast foyer, holding a dripping child in his arms, suddenly uncertain. The girl finally looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him catch his breath, a shadow of recognition, though that was impossible. "What's your name?" he asked softly. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Sarah." Alexander nodded, trying to ignore the way his heart clenched at the name. "Well, Sarah, you're safe now. We'll figure this out together." As he carried her up the grand staircase, Neither of them could have known that this rainy night encounter would unravel a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden for over a decade. The empty halls of Morgan Estate, which had for so long echoed with nothing but silence and regret, were about to witness the beginning of an extraordinary story. Mrs. Henderson worked with quiet efficiency, helping Sarah into dry clothes while Alexander paced in his study. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the mansion, a different kind of turbulence was brewing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen those eyes before, that particular shade of hazel that seemed to hold secrets beyond their years. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway, her usual composure slightly ruffled. "She's changed and settled in the blue guest room, Mr. Morgan, but there's something you should see." She held out a leather-bound notebook, water-stained and worn at the edges. "This fell from her backpack while I was helping her change." Alexander took the notebook, his fingers tracing the faded cover. "Did you look inside?" "Just the first page, sir, the drawings." Mrs. Henderson hesitated, something she rarely did in her 20 years of service. "They reminded me of young Master James's sketches." The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. He hadn't heard anyone mention his son's name in years. The household knew better than to bring up the past. Yet here was Mrs. Henderson, breaking their unspoken rule, her face lined with concern. "That will be all," he said curtly, turning away. He waited until her footsteps faded before opening the notebook. The first page made his hands shake. There, drawn in crayon with childish determination, was a perfect replica of the fountain that stood in his garden, the same fountain his son had loved to sketch. Alexander flipped through the pages with growing unease. More drawings followed. A map that seemed to lead to nowhere, strange symbols that tickled at the edge of his memory, and then he nearly dropped the notebook. A photograph was tucked between the pages, its corners bent and worn. A woman smiled at the camera, her hazel eyes achingly familiar. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Reynolds entered, shaking rain from his coat. "Nasty night." "For a house call, Alex," he said, setting down his medical bag. "Mrs. Henderson filled me in. Where's the girl?" "Upstairs, third door on the right." Alexander hesitated, then added, "Thomas, before you see her, did you keep James's medical records?" The doctor's eyebrows rose. "After all these years, some of them, yes. Why?" "Just a feeling. Check her over, but pay special attention to any genetic markers." Dr. Reynolds gave him a long look, but nodded. As the doctor headed upstairs, Alexander returned to the notebook. Beyond the photograph were more drawings, each one more puzzling than the last. One page showed a house he didn't recognize, with a tree bearing what looked like golden fruit. Another displayed a series of numbers arranged in a pattern that made no sense. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway again, her face pale. "Sir, there's someone at the gate, a man asking about a little girl." Alexander's protective instincts, dormant for so long, flared to life. Did he give a name?" "No, sir, he was insistent. Security turned him away, but he left this." She held out a small object that glinted in the lamplight, a silver pendant on a broken chain. The pendant was identical to the one Sarah wore, around her neck. A crash of thunder made the windows rattle, and somewhere upstairs a child cried out. Alexander was moving before he realized it, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found Sarah sitting up in bed, Dr. Reynolds trying to calm her. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, fixed on the window where lightning illuminated the grounds below. "He's here," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken since telling Alexander her name. "He found me." Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, drawing the heavy curtains closed. "No one will hurt you," he said with a conviction that surprised him. "For you're safe here." Sarah's small hand found his, clutching it with desperate strength. In that moment, looking into those hazel eyes that stirred memories he'd tried so hard to forget, Alexander Morgan made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Thomas," he said, not looking away from Sarah, "call my lawyer, tell him to come first thing in the morning, and double the security patrols tonight." "Alex," the doctor began cautiously, "there's something you should know about her condition." "Tomorrow," Alexander cut him off. "Right now she needs rest." He squeezed Sarah's hand gently. "And someone to keep the shadows away." As he settled into the armchair beside her bed, Sarah's breathing gradually steadied. The notebook lay, forgotten in his study, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. Outside, the mysterious visitor had vanished into the storm, but Alexander knew with bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that the mystery surrounding this child would force him to confront not only his past, but also a truth so unexpected it would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. Dawn broke over Morgan Estate, painting the sky in soft pastels that belied the tension within its walls. Alexander hadn't left Sarah's side all night, watching as she finally drifted into a fitful sleep. His mind kept returning to the photograph, in her notebook, to those hazel eyes that stirred memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a breakfast tray, her normally pristine uniform showing signs of a sleepless night. "Mr. Morgan, Mr. Patterson is waiting in your study. He says it's urgent." The lawyer's early arrival spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. Alexander glanced at Sarah's sleeping form. "Stay with her," he instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson nodded, settling into the chair he vacated. As he left the room, he caught a glimpse of her reaching out to smooth Sarah's tousled hair with a tenderness that surprised him. In his study, James Patterson stood examining the fountain through the window, his briefcase clutched tightly under one arm. The lawyer turned as Alexander entered, his expression grave. "I've made some preliminary inquiries," he said without preamble. "There's no missing person report matching her description, no recent accidents involving parents. It's as if she appeared out of thin air." Alexander retrieved Sarah's notebook from his desk drawer. "What about this woman?" He showed Patterson the photograph. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, studying the image. "There's something familiar about her," Patterson mused. "Let me run it through my contacts. But Alex, we need to discuss the legal implications here. You can't simply keep an unidentified child in your home." "I'm not sending her to the system." Alexander's tone left no room for argument. "Not until we know who's after her." Patterson's eyebrows shot up. "After her? Alex, what aren't you telling me?" Before Alexander could respond, Dr. Reynolds burst into the study, his face ashen. "You need to see this," he said, thrusting a medical file onto the desk. "I ran some preliminary tests last night. The genetic markers. Alex, they're nearly identical to James's." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alexander gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "That's impossible." "Not impossible," Dr. Reynolds said quietly. "Just highly improbable. The condition she has, it's the same rare variant your son had. The chances of this being a coincidence are astronomical." A scream from upstairs shattered the moment. Alexander was moving before the echo faded, taking the stairs 3 at a time. He burst into the blue guest room to find Mrs. Henderson trying to calm a hysterical Sarah. "The drawing," Sarah gasped between sobs, clutching her notebook. "It's gone." Alexander quickly crossed to her side, noting how she instinctively reached for his hand. "Which drawing, Sarah?" "The special one, the one Mummy said would keep me safe." Her small fingers traced patterns on the empty page where something had clearly been torn out. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Sir, while you were downstairs, I found this." She held out a crumpled piece of paper. "It was pushed under the front door." Alexander smoothed out the paper, his blood running cold. It was the missing drawing, a complex series of interconnected symbols surrounding what appeared to be a family tree. But what made his hands shake was the handwriting in the corner, handwriting he would recognize anywhere. It was his late wife's. "Elizabeth," he whispered, the name tasting like ashes in his mouth. Sarah's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes wide. "You knew my mommy?" The question hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Alexander stared at the little girl before him, really stared, and suddenly the similarities he'd been trying to ignore became glaringly obvious. The shape of her chin, the slight tilt of her head. They were all Elizabeth, but that was impossible. Elizabeth had never mentioned another child. They had met when she was already established in her career, focused on their future together. Unless... "Mr. Morgan," Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through his thoughts. There's something else you should know. Last night, while reviewing the security footage, I saw something. The man who left the pendant? He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, watching from the shadows. She looked like the woman in the photograph. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Sarah's grip on Alexander's hand tightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried a wisdom far beyond her years. Mommy said if anything happened to her, I should find the man in the big house on the hill. She said he would understand when he saw the drawings. Her free hand touched the pendant at her throat. But the bad man followed me. He wants what Mommy hid. Alexander felt the weight of unspoken secrets pressing down on him. The woman in the shadows, the genetic markers, Elizabeth's handwriting, pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve were slowly falling into place. From downstairs came the sound of breaking glass, followed by hurried footsteps. Mrs. Henderson moved quickly to lock the door, but not before they all heard Patterson's voice raised in alarm. "Alex, someone's broken in. They're heading for the study." Alexander's security team responded with practiced efficiency, but by the time they reached the study, the intruder had vanished. All that remained was an open window, billowing curtains, and a single rose placed deliberately on Alexander's desk, yellow Elizabeth's favorite. Sarah's wheelchair had been moved to a secure room with Mrs. Henderson standing guard while Alexander assessed the damage. His study, usually a model of meticulous organization, had been ransacked. The intruder had known exactly what they were looking for. But what? "The safe," Patterson said, pointing to the painting that concealed it. "It's untouched. They weren't after money." Dr. Reynolds, who had stayed behind to examine Sarah's medical records more thoroughly, emerged from behind the heavy oak bookcase where he'd taken cover. "They went straight for the desk drawers, as if they knew about the notebook," Alexander finished. He pulled Sarah's diary from his jacket pocket, where he'd instinctively placed it during the commotion. The rose on his desk wasn't a threat. It was a message. Someone wanted him to remember. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face tight with concern. "Sir, Sarah's asking for you. She says she needs to show you something important." In the secure room, Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller than ever. But there was a determination in her eyes that reminded Alexander painfully of Elizabeth. When she saw him, she reached for her backpack. "Mommy said I should wait," she explained, pulling out a sealed envelope. "But I think it's time." Her small fingers trembled as she handed it to Alexander. "She said you'd know what to do when you saw the whole picture." The envelope was heavy, made of expensive paper. Alexander's name was written on the front in Elizabeth's elegant hand. Inside, he found a letter and another photograph, this one of Elizabeth holding a baby, standing in front of a familiar fountain. "I need everyone out," Alexander said quietly, "except Sarah." When they were alone, he unfolded the letter, his heart pounding. Elizabeth's words, written years ago, spilled across the page. "My dearest Alexander, if you're reading this, then our daughter has found her way to you, just as I prayed she would. There's so much to explain. So many choices I made that will seem unforgivable, but everything I did was to protect her, to protect both of our children. Sarah was born before we met, during a time in my life I never spoke about. Her father was a cruel man who saw her only as a means to control his family's fortune. When I discovered I was pregnant, I ran. I created a new life, met you, fell in love. But the past has a way of finding us. What happened to James wasn't an accident. They were looking for something that night, something they thought I had hidden. They didn't know I had already entrusted it to our daughter, our beautiful secret daughter, who I had to keep hidden to keep safe. The drawings in Sarah's notebook are more than they appear. Together, they form a map leading to evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching back generations. The pendant she wears is a key, but it's worthless without the other half, the half I gave to you on our wedding day, disguised as a simple gift. Look closely at the fountain in the photograph. Remember what James always said about the water spirits hiding treasures? He was closer to the truth than he knew. Protect her, Alexander. Help her finish what I started, and please, when you know everything, find it in your heart to forgive me. All my love, Elizabeth. Alexander looked up from the letter to find Sarah, watching him intently. "The fountain," she said softly. "That's where Mommy said to look first." Outside the window, the garden fountain sparkled in the morning sun, its waters holding secrets that had waited years to be discovered. Alexander remembered countless afternoons watching James sketch that fountain, his son's imagination transforming the flowing water into fantastic stories. Had Elizabeth known even then? Had she been leaving them clues all along? "Your brother," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "He used to say there were secrets in that fountain. Would you like to hear about him?" Sarah's eyes lit up, and for the first time since she arrived, a genuine smile crossed her face. "I have a brother?" "Had," Alexander corrected gently, his heart aching. "His name was James, and he was a lot like you. He loved to draw, loved to imagine stories hidden in ordinary things. As he began to share memories he'd locked away for so long, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The ice that had encased his heart for years began to crack, but even as he opened himself to this newfound connection, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In the garden, below, a shadow moved among the roses, and somewhere in the distance a car engine started. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Morgan Estate's manicured lawns as Alexander wheeled Sarah toward the fountain. Mrs. Henderson followed at a discreet distance, her watchful eyes scanning the grounds. The security team had been doubled, with guards positioned at strategic points around the property. The fountain's marble basin gleamed, water cascading over 3 tiers in a hypnotic rhythm. Sarah leaned forward in her wheelchair, studying the intricate carvings that decorated the base. "James's drawings," she said, pointing to a particular section. "They match these symbols." Alexander knelt beside her wheelchair, seeing the fountain through new eyes. The decorative patterns he'd dismissed as mere ornamental flourishes now seemed deliberate, meaningful. "Your mother commissioned this fountain," he said slowly, memories surfacing like bubbles in water. "She insisted on this exact design." Sarah pulled her notebook from her backpack, flipping to a specific page. The drawing there wasn't just a child's recreation of the fountain, it was a key. When held up against the fountain's base, certain symbols aligned perfectly. "Mommy said the water knows the way," Sarah murmured, her small finger tracing a particular groove in the marble. "But we need both keys to make it work." Alexander reached into his pocket, withdrawing the pendant Elizabeth had given him on their wedding day. He'd always assumed it was just a family heirloom, a beautiful but simple piece of jewelry. Now holding it next to Sarah's matching pendant, he saw how the 2 pieces could fit together. Mrs. Henderson approached, carrying a tray with tea and sandwiches. "Mr. Morgan, perhaps we should continue this after lunch. The young miss needs to keep up her strength." But Sarah's attention remained fixed on the fountain. "Look," she whispered, pointing to where the afternoon sun hit the water at a particular angle. For a brief moment, the light created a pattern on the fountain's surface, a pattern that matched one of the mysterious symbols in her notebook. Alexander's mind raced back to something James had once said while sketching this very fountain. "Dad, the lady in the water told me where to look." He dismissed it as childhood imagination at the time, but now... "Mrs. Henderson," he called, "bring me James's old sketchbooks from the library." While they waited, Sarah told him about the dreams she'd been having, dreams where a boy she'd never met showed her secret passages and hidden doors. "He looks like the pictures in your study," she said. "He tells me not to be afraid." Alexander's throat tightened. The security cameras had shown no sign of the intruder who'd left the rose, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being guided, led along a path Elizabeth had laid out years ago. Mrs. Henderson returned with a stack of worn sketchbooks. Alexander recognized them immediately. He'd kept every drawing James had ever made, though he hadn't been able to look at them in years. Together they began comparing James's childhood sketches with Sarah's drawings. The similarities were uncanny. Both children had drawn the fountain from the same unusual angles, had focused on the same seemingly random details. But James's later sketches contained something more, mathematical equations hidden within the artistic flourishes. Dr. Reynolds said James had a unique way of seeing patterns, Alexander explained to Sarah. We thought it was connected to his condition, the same condition you have. Sarah nodded solemnly. Mommy called it our special gift. She said it helps us see things others can't. As they studied the drawings, Alexander noticed something else. When overlaid, James's sketches and Sarah's drawings formed a complete image, one that revealed a hidden compartment in the fountain's base. The pendants, Sarah said suddenly, her eyes bright with understanding. They're not just keys, they're a compass. Alexander examined both pendants more closely. When held together in a certain way, they formed an arrow. Following its direction led to a specific point on the fountain's base where the marble seemed slightly different from the rest. "Sir," Mrs. Henderson interrupted urgently, "Mr. Patterson is on the phone. He says he's found something about the woman in the photograph, something that changes everything." But Alexander was already pressing the pendants into the groove they'd discovered. There was a soft click, then the sound of moving water changed subtly. A small compartment had opened in the fountain's base, revealing a waterproof case. Inside, they found a USB drive and another letter from Elizabeth, this one dated just days before the accident that had taken her and James away from him. Before Alexander could read it, movement at the edge of the garden caught his attention. A figure stood partially hidden behind an oak tree, watching them. As security moved to investigate, the person stepped into the light. Alexander heard Mrs. Henderson gasp. The woman from the photograph, the one who had been seen in the security footage, was walking toward them, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. But it wasn't her presence that made Alexander's heart stop. It was her face, identical to Elizabeth's in every way. Time seemed to freeze as the woman approached, her resemblance to Elizabeth becoming more striking with each step. Sarah gripped Alexander's hand tightly, her other hand clutching her mother's letter. The security team flanked the woman, but she had eyes only for Sarah. "Hello, little one," she said softly, her voice an echo of Elizabeth's. "You've grown so much." "Aunt Claire," Sarah whispered, and Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Elizabeth had never mentioned a sister, let alone a twin, but the evidence was standing before him, wearing Elizabeth's face like a ghost made flesh. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward protectively, positioning herself between Sarah and the newcomer. "Ms. Claire Blackwood," she announced, her voice carrying a weight of recognition. "I should have known you'd return." Alexander's head snapped toward his housekeeper. "You knew about her?" "I knew many things, sir," Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes never leaving Claire. "Your wife made me promise to keep certain secrets until the right time. I believe that time has come." Claire Blackwood moved closer, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Elizabeth and I were separated as children after our parents' accident. She was adopted by the Warrens, given a new life, a new identity. I remained Claire Blackwood, heir to a fortune that brought nothing but misery." "The man who's been following Sarah," Alexander began. "Victor Blackwood," Claire finished. "Our uncle, the one who orchestrated our parents' accident, who's been searching for the evidence of his crimes for 20 years. The same man who caused the accident that took Elizabeth and James." Sarah's grip on Alexander's hand tightened. "He wanted Mommy's special box, the one in the fountain," Claire nodded. "Elizabeth found documents in our father's study before she ran away, proof of everything Victor had done. She knew I was working to expose him from the inside, so she split the evidence between us. The pendants, the drawings, all of it was part of her plan." "Why didn't she tell me?" Alexander demanded, years of pain and confusion turning to anger. "To protect you," Mrs. Henderson interjected, "and to protect Sarah. The less you knew, the safer you all were. Elizabeth knew that if anything happened to her, Sarah would eventually find her way to you. The genetic condition she shares with James, it was her proof of parentage, her way of confirming her identity." Alexander's mind raced back through the years, seeing past events in a new light. Elizabeth's frequent business trips, her insistence on designing the fountain, her careful documentation of James's condition, it had all been part of a larger plan. "The USB drive," Claire said, gesturing to the waterproof case. "It contains banking records, surveillance footage, witness statements, everything needed to prove Victor's crimes. Elizabeth encrypted it using a code only someone with their unique genetic condition could decipher. That's why she knew Sarah and James would be able to understand the drawings. Sarah opened her notebook, showing Claire a particular page. "The numbers dance," she said, "just like they did for James." Claire smiled sadly. "Yes, sweetheart. It's how your mind works, seeing patterns others can't. Elizabeth had it too, though not as strongly. It's why Victor could never crack her codes." A sudden breeze carried the scent of roses across the garden, and Alexander remembered the yellow bloom left in his study. "You broke in last night." "I had to be sure Sarah had made it safely," Claire admitted, "and I needed you to find Elizabeth's letter at the right moment. There's more to this than just Victor's crimes, Alexander. Elizabeth left something else for Sarah, something that could change everything." Before she could elaborate, Mrs. Henderson's phone buzzed. Her face paled as she read the message. "Mr. Patterson says Victor Blackwood was just appointed Sarah's legal guardian by the court. He's on his way here with the paperwork." The sound of approaching vehicles echoed from the front drive. Claire moved swiftly, pressing something into Alexander's hand, a key with an unusual pattern that matched one of the symbols in Sarah's drawings. "There's a safe house," she said urgently. "Elizabeth prepared it years ago. The drawings in Sarah's notebook will lead you there, but only if you follow them exactly. Trust no one except Mrs. Henderson." Sarah looked up at Alexander, her eyes filled with the same determination he'd so often seen in Elizabeth's. "We need to finish Mommy's story," she said. "Together." As the sounds of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the mansion, Alexander made a decision. He'd lost his family once by not seeing what was right in front of him. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them, "prepare the back entrance. It's time Sarah and I took a little trip." The housekeeper smiled, a glint of fierce loyalty in her eyes. "I'll handle everything here, sir. Claire, you'd better come with me. We need to give them time." As Mrs. Henderson led Claire away, Alexander knelt beside Sarah's wheelchair. "Your mother once told me that the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight. I didn't understand then, but I do now." He touched the pendant around his neck, watching it catch the light. "Are you ready for an adventure?" Sarah's answering smile was pure Elizabeth. "I've been ready my whole life." The service tunnels beneath Morgan Estate had existed since the mansion's construction in the 1920s, a remnant of a more elegant era. As Alexander navigated Sarah's wheelchair through the dimly lit passage, he couldn't help but wonder if Elizabeth had known about them all along. The tunnels weren't on any official blueprints, yet Sarah's notebook contained a crude but accurate map of their layout. "Mum used to tell me stories about secret passages," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "She said they were like veins carrying secrets through the heart of old houses." Alexander checked his phone's display. No signal, exactly as Mrs. Henderson had predicted. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of footsteps and voices. As Victor Blackwood and his entourage searched the mansion, the old tunnel would lead them to a maintenance exit near the garden's eastern boundary, where Mrs. Henderson had arranged for a car to be waiting. "Tell me about the stories your mother told you," Alexander said, partly to keep Sarah calm and partly because each revelation about Elizabeth's secret life felt like fitting together pieces of an elaborate puzzle. Sarah's hands moved across the pages of her notebook in the beam of their flashlight. "She said there was a special place where all the answers were hidden, but we had to follow the trail exactly right to find it. Like a treasure hunt, but the treasure was the truth." They reached a junction where 3 tunnels converged. Sarah consulted her notebook, then pointed to the right passage. "This one. Look at the wall. There's the mark." Alexander raised his flashlight, revealing a small carved symbol matching one from Sarah's drawings. He was beginning to understand the brilliance of Elizabeth's plan. She'd created a guidance system that only someone with Sarah's unique way of seeing patterns could follow. The sound of their pursuers grew fainter as they moved deeper into the tunnel network. Alexander's phone buzzed with a single text message that had queued before they lost signal, from Claire. "Trust the drawings. Elizabeth left breadcrumbs we never saw." Sarah suddenly grabbed Alexander's arm. "Wait, there's something here." She pointed to what appeared to be an ordinary section of wall, but when Alexander ran his hands over it, he felt subtle irregularities in the brickwork, "The key Aunt Claire gave you," Sarah urged. "It's not for a door. It's for this." Alexander examined the key more closely. What he'd taken for decorative patterns were actually a series of raised dots and lines, a code. He found a nearly invisible keyhole and inserted the key. With a soft click, a small compartment opened in the wall. Inside was a leather portfolio, its contents protected from the tunnel's dampness by careful waterproofing. Alexander quickly tucked it into Sarah's backpack. There would be time to examine it later. They continued through the tunnels, following Sarah's directions. The path took them deeper than Alexander had expected, and he began to worry they'd taken a wrong turn. But Sarah remained confident, checking her notebook against marks on the walls that would have been invisible to anyone not knowing exactly what to look for. "James would have loved this," Alexander said softly, remembering how his son had always been fascinated by codes and hidden messages. He used to create elaborate scavenger hunts throughout the house. Sarah smiled in the dim light. "I know. Mum showed me some of his old puzzles. She said we thought the same way. That's why we could both see the patterns." They reached another junction, this one featuring a modern steel door incongruous with the old brickwork. It had a keypad lock, but instead of numbers it displayed symbols similar to those in Sarah's notebook. "This is new," Alexander muttered, examining the keypad. Sarah flipped through her notebook excitedly. "No, look, it's in James's drawings. Too? See how the symbols match? He must have found this place." Alexander's heart clenched. Had James discovered these tunnels before the accident? Had he been trying to tell them something with his drawings? Sarah studied the keypad intently, her fingers hovering over the symbols. "The patterns, they're like music notes. James drew them that way too. Remember the song Mum used to sing?" Alexander did remember. Elizabeth had often sung a particular lullaby to James, one she claimed was a family tradition. Now he wondered if it had been more than that, if it had been another piece of her elaborate security system. "Can you hum it?" he asked Sarah. As she did, Alexander watched her fingers tap against her notebook in rhythm. The pattern matched specific symbols on the keypad. Following her lead, he pressed the corresponding buttons. The door opened with a soft hiss, revealing a modern elevator, hidden behind it. On its control panel was a single button marked with a symbol that matched the final drawing in Sarah's notebook. "Mum said when we found the singing door we'd be almost there," Sarah whispered. "The safe house is waiting." Distant voices echoed through the tunnels. Their pursuers were getting closer. Alexander wheeled Sarah into the elevator, his hand hovering over the button. Once pressed, there would be no going back. "Ready for the next chapter of our adventure?" he asked, managing a smile despite his racing heart. Sarah clutched her notebook tightly. "Mom always said the best stories are the ones we write together." Alexander pressed the button, and the elevator doors closed silently. As they began to descend, Sarah pulled out the leather portfolio they'd found. Its contents might hold more pieces of Elizabeth's puzzle, more steps on the trail she'd left for them to follow. What neither of them could know was that they weren't the only ones following that trail. The elevator descended smoothly for what felt like an eternity before coming to a gentle stop. When the doors opened, Alexander and Sarah found themselves in a space that defied their expectations. Instead of another tunnel, they entered what appeared to be a sophisticated living quarters, complete with modern furnishings and state-of-the-art technology. "Welcome home," an automated voice announced, startling them both. Voice print recognized Sarah Blackwood Morgan, security protocols disengaged. Alexander wheeled Sarah into the space, taking in their surroundings. The walls were lined with monitors displaying security feeds from various locations, including, he noticed with surprise, several angles of his own mansion. Elizabeth had been watching all this time. "Mom brought me here once," Sarah said, moving toward a specific corner of the room. "She said it was our special place, but we couldn't stay long. She was worried someone was following us." The leather portfolio they'd recovered from the tunnel seemed to vibrate with possibility in Sarah's backpack. Alexander helped her retrieve it, and together they opened it on a sleek desk that dominated one wall. Inside, they found more than just documents. There were photographs, letters, and most intriguingly, a series of small notebooks filled with Elizabeth's handwriting. These are her research journals, Alexander realized, recognizing her distinctive penmanship. She was documenting everything. Sarah was already flipping through one of the notebooks, her fingers tracing the lines of text and diagrams with practiced ease. "Look," she said, pointing to a particular page. She wrote about James here, about how his condition wasn't just a medical issue, it was an inheritance. Alexander read the passage she indicated. The pattern recognition ability manifests differently in each generation, but it's strongest in the children. James and Sarah show unprecedented levels of cognitive connection to symbolic languages. What Victor sees as a defect is actually an evolution, nature's way of protecting its own secrets. The implications made Alexander's head spin. Elizabeth had been conducting her own investigation, using her scientific background to understand the genetic quirk that connected her children. But why? A soft chime from one of the security monitors drew their attention. Mrs. Henderson's face appeared. On the screen, her expression urgent. "Mr. Morgan, they've discovered the tunnel entrance. Claire is delaying them, but you need to keep moving. Have you found it yet?" "Found what?" Alexander asked, but Sarah was already wheeling herself toward a wall panel that looked slightly different from the others. "The truth box," she said confidently. "That's what Mom called it. She said when the time came, we'd need what's inside to make everything right." The panel responded to Sarah's touch, sliding aside to reveal a safe with another symbolic keypad. But this one was different. The symbols were arranged in a spiral pattern that seemed to pulse with a subtle light. "It's a music box," Sarah explained, her fingers hovering over the symbols. "Like the one James used to play with, remember? The one that only worked if you pressed the notes in the right order?" Alexander remembered. It had been a peculiar antique, a gift from Elizabeth that James had treasured. The boy had spent hours working out its complex mechanical puzzle, claiming the melody it played was trying to tell him something. "Your mother wasn't just leaving us clues," Alexander said slowly, watching Sarah work out the pattern. "She was leaving us a legacy, a way to understand everything," Sarah finished. Her fingers began to dance across the symbols in a complex sequence. James figured out part of it before the accident. That's why his last drawings were different. He was trying to show us what he'd learned. The safe opened with a musical chime that brought tears to Alexander's eyes. It was the same melody from James's music box, the lullaby Elizabeth had sung to both her children. Inside was a single tablet computer, its screen flickering to life at their approach. On it was a video file labeled "For When You're Ready." Elizabeth's face filled the screen, looking exactly as Alexander remembered her. But now he could see what he'd missed before. The weight of secrets in her eyes, the careful way she chose her words. "My darlings," she began, "if you're watching this, then everything I feared has come to pass, but everything I hoped for has also come true. You found each other. You followed the path I left. And now it's time for you to know the whole story." Sarah reached for Alexander's hand as Elizabeth's image continued to speak, revealing truths that had been hidden for years, about the Blackwood family's true legacy, about why Victor had been so desperate to keep certain secrets buried, about the real reason she'd had to keep Sarah hidden, but most importantly, about hope, about the future she'd carefully planned, for even knowing she might not be there to see it. On the security monitors, they could see Victor's men getting closer to discovering the elevator. But Alexander and Sarah barely noticed, transfixed by Elizabeth's final message, and the key she'd left them to unlock the last and greatest secret of all. A secret that would change not just their lives, but the lives of children like Sarah and James all over the world. Children whose condition wasn't a flaw but a gift, one that Elizabeth had died protecting. "The next step," Elizabeth's recording concluded, "is in a place only Sarah can find. Trust her instincts, Alexander. She'll know the way." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes shining with purpose. "Mom always said the best hiding place is in plain sight. I know where we need to go next." The security monitor chimed again, this time showing Claire running through the tunnels, pursued by shadows. They were out of time. "The back exit," Sarah said, pointing to a hidden door behind a bookshelf. "It leads to the old railway station. Mom said it would be our escape route, but only if we solved the puzzle first." Alexander looked at the tablet, at Sarah's notebook, at the legacy Elizabeth had left them. They had the pieces now. All they needed was the courage to use them. "Then let's solve it," he said, wheeling Sarah toward the exit. "Together." The old railway station lay buried beneath decades of urban development, a relic of the city's industrial past that most had forgotten. As Alexander and Sarah emerged from the hidden exit, the musty air carried whispers of a bygone era. Their flashlights revealed elaborate Victorian architectural details, preserved in the perpetual darkness. "Mom said this place was special," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing softly off the tiled walls. "She called it the crossroads of secrets." Alexander studied their surroundings, noting how the station's layout matched one of the more cryptic drawings in Sarah's notebook. The main platform stretched before them, its marble floor inlaid with an intricate pattern of geometric shapes. Above, a vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows, its frescoes barely visible in their flashlight beams. "The tablet," Sarah said suddenly, pulling Elizabeth's device from her backpack. "Look at how the light hits the floor. It's the same pattern as in Mum's video." Alexander knelt beside Sarah's wheelchair, watching as she navigated through the tablet's contents. Elizabeth had left them more than just her final message. Hidden in subfolders were architectural drawings of the station, but with annotations that made no sense at first glance. These aren't just notes, Alexander realized, comparing them to Sarah's notebook. They're coordinates. Elizabeth was using the station's original design as some kind of map. Sarah's fingers traced the patterns on both screens, her mind making connections that Alexander could only marvel at. The symbols in James's drawings, they're showing us which way to go. See how they match the tiles? Following Sarah's guidance, Alexander wheeled her along the platform, watching as she counted specific tiles and geometric shapes. They stopped at what appeared to be an ordinary section of wall, but Sarah insisted it was important. "James drew this exact spot," she said, pulling out a specific page from her notebook. "He wrote, 'Where the lines meet, time stops.'" I didn't understand before, but now Alexander examined the wall more closely. Beneath years of grime, he could just make out a series of lines carved into the stone. They converged at a point that aligned perfectly with a symbol in Sarah's notebook. "Your mother," he said slowly. "She must have found this place years ago. She knew James would be drawn to its patterns, just like you are." Sarah nodded eagerly. "It's like she built a puzzle that only our minds could solve. James started it, and now I'm finishing it." A distant echo of footsteps made them both freeze. Someone else had found the station entrance. Alexander quickly turned off their flashlights, plunging them into darkness broken only by the soft glow of the tablet screen. "We need to hurry," he whispered, but Sarah was already focused on the wall, her fingers moving across the carved lines with purpose. "It's a pressure sequence," she explained, pressing specific points in a pattern that matched the melody from Elizabeth's music box. Like piano keys but invisible. A soft click emanated from within the wall, followed by the sound of ancient machinery coming to life. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage lit by emergency lighting strips. "She upgraded it," Sarah said with a hint of pride. "Mum said the original station had maintenance tunnels, but she made them better, safer." They hurried through the opening, the door sliding shut behind them, just as voices became audible from the main platform. The passage was modern, clearly part of Elizabeth's renovations with smooth walls and proper ventilation. "This way," Sarah directed, consulting both the tablet and her notebook. "There's something Mom called the archive ahead. She said it's where she kept all the evidence, everything she couldn't risk Victor finding." Alexander pushed the wheelchair forward, noting how the passage was perfectly sized to accommodate it. Elizabeth had thought of everything, planned for this very moment years in advance. They reached another door, this one protected by a biometric scanner. Sarah pressed her palm against it without hesitation. The scanner glowed green, and the door opened to reveal a sight that made Alexander catch his breath. The room before them was a command center straight out of a spy movie. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying data feeds and surveillance footage. In the center stood a massive circular desk, its surface one giant touchscreen display. "Welcome to the archive." The same automated voice from the safe house greeted them. Full access granted to Sarah Blackwood Morgan, initiating primary protocols. The screens came alive with information. Decades of research, financial records, surveillance footage, all meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced. Elizabeth had built a digital fortress right under the city's feet. "Look," Sarah gasped, pointing to one of the screens. It showed a real-time feed of the station platform they'd just left. Victor Blackwood stood there with his men, examining the wall they'd passed through. But he was looking in the wrong place, following a different set of patterns, ones that led nowhere. "Your mother," Alexander said with growing admiration. "She didn't just hide the truth. She protected it with layers of misdirection. Only someone who could see the real patterns would find their way here." Sarah was already interfacing with the main console, her fingers dancing across the touchscreen with intuitive understanding. Windows of information flew past until she found what she was looking for, a file labeled Project Legacy. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what Mum was really working on, why she had to keep me hidden." She looked up at Alexander, her eyes bright with purpose. "It's not just about Victor and the family fortune. It's about all of us, everyone like me and James. Mum found something in our genetic code, something that could change everything." Before she could explain further, a warning light began flashing on one of the security monitors. Claire's face appeared on a screen, her expression urgent. "They're using sonic scanners to map the station walls," she reported. "Victor's getting closer. You need to access the final protocol, now." Sarah turned back to the console, her fingers flying over the controls. "Mum said when the time came we'd have to make a choice, stay hidden and safe, or risk everything to expose the truth." She looked up at Alexander, seeking guidance. In her eyes, he saw Elizabeth's determination, James's curiosity, and something uniquely her own, hope. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. Alexander looked at the screens around them, at the years of careful planning and sacrifice that had led to this moment. He thought of James, of Elizabeth, of all the secrets that had shaped their lives. His answer would set in motion events that couldn't be undone. Alexander placed his hand over Sarah's on the console. "Your mother spent years protecting this truth," he said softly. "Not to keep it hidden forever, but to make sure it would be revealed at the right time by the right people." He squeezed her hand gently. "I think that time is now." Sarah's fingers moved decisively across the touchscreen, activating what Elizabeth had labeled the Legacy Protocol. The archive's screens flickered, then displayed a countdown timer. Whatever they had set in motion, there would be no turning back. "Mom said the Legacy Protocol would send everything to people who could help," Sarah explained, watching as progress bars began filling across multiple screens. Journalists, scientists, advocacy groups, people who would understand what it means and use it to protect others like us. The data began streaming out through secure channels Elizabeth had established years ago. Financial records showing how Victor had manipulated genetic research for profit. Medical files documenting the true nature of the conditions Sarah and James shared. Evidence of a systematic attempt to suppress information about children born with enhanced pattern recognition abilities. "It's not a disability," Sarah said, reading through the files as they transferred. "Mum discovered that our brains process information differently because they're evolved to understand complex patterns in ways most people can't. Victor wanted to control this ability, to use it for his own gain." Alexander watched as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Elizabeth's careful documentation showed how Victor had attempted to identify and manipulate children born with this genetic variation, all while maintaining public records that classified it as a medical condition requiring treatment. "The accident," Alexander said suddenly, remembering that terrible night. "The one that took Elizabeth and James. It wasn't because Victor was looking for documents, was it? He was trying to stop her from exposing the truth about the genetic research." Sarah nodded solemnly. Mom knew he was getting close. That's why She had to hide me somewhere he'd never think to look, with my own father who didn't know I existed. She knew that eventually my abilities would help me find my way back here. A notification flashed across the main screen. The first batch of data had been received by its intended recipients. Around the world, people were beginning to uncover the truth Elizabeth had died protecting. But they weren't safe yet. The PE security feeds showed Victor's men methodically scanning the station walls, their equipment growing more sophisticated with each passing minute. They were running out of time. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, accessing a hidden partition on the system. Mom left a message specifically for this moment. She said we'd know when to play it. The screen filled with Elizabeth's face once more, but this recording was different from the others. She looked tired, worried, but determined. "My dearest Sarah and Alexander," she began, "if you're watching, then the legacy protocol has been activated. The truth about the genetic variation, what Victor calls a condition, but what I've come to understand as an evolutionary gift, is finally being revealed to the world." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But the most important truth isn't in any of those files. It's sitting right in front of you, Alexander. Sarah isn't just evidence of what Victor tried to hide. She's proof of what's possible when these gifts are nurtured instead of suppressed. She and James, they were meant to grow up together, to show the world that being different isn't something to fear." The recording continued, but Alexander's attention was drawn to one of the security monitors. Claire was sending them an urgent message. Victor had found something. "We need to move," he said, but Sarah held up her hand, transfixed by her mother's final message. "There's a secondary exit," Elizabeth was saying, "one that not even Victor knows about. Sarah will see the path. It's in the station's original blueprints, hidden in plain sight just like everything else. And Alexander," she smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made his heart ache. "Thank you for keeping our daughter safe, even when you didn't know she was yours. The love you gave James, the love you're now giving Sarah, it's the greatest protection of all." The recording ended just as a deep rumbling shook the archive. Victor's scanning equipment had detected something. Sarah was already studying the station blueprints, her mind working through the patterns. "There," she said, pointing to what looked like a maintenance shaft. "Mom altered the original plans but kept the old markings. Everyone would assume it was sealed off decades ago." Alexander began gathering what they needed: the tablet, Sarah's notebook, anything that could lead Victor to the truth if left behind. The archive systems were already initiating their security protocols, systematically erasing local data now that everything had been transmitted. "Ready for one more adventure?" he asked Sarah, seeing in her determined expression the same strength he'd always admired in Elizabeth. Sarah clutched her notebook to her chest and nodded. "Mom said the best stories never really end. They just become part of a bigger story." As they made their way to the hidden exit, leaving behind the archive and all its secrets, Alexander realized Elizabeth had given them one final gift. Not just the truth about Sarah's abilities or the evidence to stop Victor, but something far more precious, a chance to be the family they were always meant to be. Behind them, the archive screens went dark one by one, their mission complete. But somewhere in the digital world, Elizabeth's legacy was already spreading, reaching out to others like Sarah and James, carrying a message of hope and understanding. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The maintenance shaft turned out to be a marvel of Elizabeth's foresight. What appeared on the original blueprints as a simple utility tunnel had been transformed into a sophisticated escape route, complete with modern ventilation and emergency lighting that activated as they proceeded. "Mom called this the Echo Path," Sarah explained, as Alexander carefully maneuvered her wheelchair through the tunnel. "She said it's because sounds from the city above create patterns down here, patterns that help guide the way." True to her words, the tunnel seemed to amplify and channel sounds from above, distant traffic, subway trains, and the urban heartbeat of the city itself. To Alexander's ears, it was just noise, but he watched in amazement as Sarah tilted her head, listening intently. "Turn left here," she said confidently. "The echoes are stronger this way. Mum said to follow the strongest sound. It leads to where the old subway lines intersect with the new ones. As they navigated the tunnels, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at Elizabeth's brilliance. She hadn't just created a physical escape route, she designed it to be navigable specifically by someone with Sarah's unique abilities. The very gift that Victor had tried to suppress had become their salvation. A soft chime from the tablet interrupted their progress. It was an encrypted message from Claire. Victor's men have breached the archive, but they're too late. The legacy protocol is complete. Data is already being analyzed by trusted sources worldwide. Be careful though, he's desperate now. Sarah clutched her notebook tighter. There's something else in here, she said, flipping to pages she hadn't shown before. Drawings I made but didn't understand, until now. She pointed to a series of sketches that at first glance looked like abstract patterns. They're sound waves, the same ones we're hearing now. Alexander studied the drawings more closely. Overlaid on the wave patterns were numbers and symbols that reminded him of musical notation. James used to do something similar, he remembered. He said he could see music in ways other people couldn't. Exactly, Sarah's eyes lit up. Mum said it's part of how our minds work. We don't just recognize patterns, we can translate them between different senses. That's why the escape route uses sound instead of visual markers. Anyone following us would need more than just maps or tracking equipment. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant rumbling, different from the usual city sounds. Victor's teams were using sonic mapping equipment again, trying to trace their path through the tunnel network. We need to move faster, Alexander said, but Sarah raised her hand for silence, her expression concentrated. Wait, she whispered. Listen to the interference pattern. Their equipment. It's creating a new sound map, one that shows. She quickly flipped through her notebook, matching the sound to one of her drawings. There's another tunnel, one that's not even on Mum's plans. The vibrations are revealing hidden passages. Alexander hesitated. Following an unmapped tunnel was risky, but he trusted Sarah's instincts, trusted the gift that Elizabeth had helped her understand and develop. Are you sure about this? He asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah nodded firmly. Mum always said the best hiding places are the ones that reveal themselves only when you need them most. Like this notebook, the drawings changed meaning when the right moment came. They found the hidden passage behind what appeared to be a maintenance panel. Like the entrance to the archive, it responded to Sarah's touch, sliding aside to reveal a narrow but well-maintained tunnel. As they entered, Sarah gasped softly. The walls were lined with a subtle pattern of raised dots and lines, similar to the key Claire had given them, but on a much larger scale. It's a message, Sarah said, her fingers tracing the patterns. Written in a code that looks like maintenance markings to anyone else. Mum left directions to somewhere called the Sanctuary. The tablet chimed again. Another message. From Claire. Mrs. Henderson has secured the evidence from the mansion. She's heading to the rendezvous point with everything from Elizabeth's study. But you need to hurry. Victor's bringing in more equipment. Sarah was already reading ahead through the wall markings, her mind translating the complex code with remarkable speed. The Sanctuary, she explained. It's not just a hiding place. Mum wrote that it's a research center hidden in plain sight, a place where others like me and James can be safe, can learn to understand their abilities without fear. Alexander thought about all the children like Sarah and James, children whose unique way of seeing the world had been treated as a problem to be fixed rather than a gift to be nurtured. Elizabeth hadn't just been protecting her own children, she'd been working to create a safe haven for all of them. A series of rapid beeps from their tablet warned that Victor's teams were getting closer. The sonic mapping equipment was becoming more sophisticated, better at penetrating the layers of rock and concrete that surrounded them. We're almost there, Sarah assured him, her eyes never leaving the coded message on the walls. The Sanctuary's entrance is hidden in plain sight, just like everything else Mom created. But we'll only have one chance to access it before the security protocols seal it off. Alexander checked their tablet's remaining power, less than 20%. They would need to be careful with their resources. Then let's make it count, he said, his voice filled with determination. Your mother spent years preparing for this moment. We won't let her down." As they pressed forward, the distant sounds of pursuit growing fainter, neither of them noticed the small red light blinking rhythmically on Sarah's wheelchair, a light that hadn't been there before they entered the tunnels. The tunnel emerged into what appeared to be a mundane maintenance room in the basement of a modern office building. But Sarah's excited whisper told Alexander this was exactly where they needed to be. "Look at the floor pattern," she said, pointing to what seemed like ordinary industrial tiles. "It's the same design as the last page in my notebook. We're here. This is the outer entrance to the sanctuary." Alexander studied their surroundings more carefully. The room appeared perfectly ordinary. Cleaning supplies, electrical panels, storage shelves. But he'd learned to trust that appearances could be deceiving. Elizabeth had proven herself a master of hiding extraordinary things in plain sight. Sarah was already pulling out her notebook, comparing the floor pattern to her drawings. "Each tile is part of a larger pattern," she explained. "Like a giant version of the puzzle box James used to play with. We need to activate them in the right sequence." The tablet chimed with another message from Claire. "Victor's men have reached the surface. They're systematically searching every building in a 10-block radius. Be careful, they're using thermal imaging now." As if in response to Claire's warning, they heard footsteps and voices from the corridor outside. Alexander quickly pushed Sarah's wheelchair behind a large storage shelf, holding his breath as shadows passed beneath the door. "We need to hurry," he whispered once the footsteps had faded. "How do we activate the entrance?" Sarah pointed to specific tiles in the floor. "It's a pressure sequence like in the station, but this one's different. It needs 2 people. The patterns have to be activated simultaneously." She looked up at Alexander. "Mom designed it, so I couldn't do it alone. She knew I'd need help, your help." Alexander studied the patterns Sarah indicated. The tiles she pointed to were spread out, requiring precise timing and coordination to activate together. He and Sarah would need to work in perfect synchronization. "Tell me exactly what to do," he said, moving into position. Sarah directed him with quiet confidence, explaining how the pressure points needed to be activated in a specific rhythm, like playing a duet on a piano. As they worked together, Alexander couldn't help but think of James, of how he and his son had once collaborated on complex puzzles and games. Now he was doing the same with the daughter he'd never known he had. The floor beneath them began to vibrate subtly as they completed the sequence. One of the electrical panels slid aside silently, revealing a state-of-the-art elevator. But before they could move toward it, Sarah grabbed Alexander's arm. "Wait," she said urgently. "Something's wrong." Her hands moved quickly over her wheelchair, finding what Alexander had missed. A tiny tracking device, no bigger than a button, attached beneath the seat. Alexander's blood ran cold. They'd been followed after all, led Victor's men right to the sanctuary's doorstep. But how? The elevator's security systems would have detected it, Sarah said, her mind racing ahead. Mom would have thought of that. We need to... She never finished her sentence. The maintenance room door burst open, and Victor Blackwood himself stepped through, flanked by 2 men in tactical gear. "I must admit," Victor said, his voice smooth and cultured, "Elizabeth outdid herself with this setup, using the children's unique abilities as both lock and key. Brilliant." He moved into the room, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "But she made one crucial mistake. She underestimated how well I understand these genetic gifts." Alexander moved protectively in front of Sarah's wheelchair, but Victor merely smiled. "Come now, Alexander. Surely you've realized by now that I never intended to harm the girl. She's far too valuable. All of them are." "You've lost, Victor," Alexander replied firmly. "The legacy protocol is complete. Your research, your experiments, the truth about what you've done, it's all being exposed as we speak." "Exposed?" Victor laughed softly. "My dear boy, what makes you think I wanted to keep it hidden? Elizabeth's evidence doesn't destroy my work. It validates it. Proof that these children are more than ordinary, that their abilities are real and quantifiable. The world will finally have to acknowledge what I've known all along." Sarah's hand found Alexander's, squeezing it gently. He felt something pressed. Into his palm, her notebook. While Victor was talking, she'd been silently working on something else. "You're right about one thing," Sarah said, her voice stronger than Alexander had ever heard it. "Mom did understand our abilities. She knew exactly how they worked." She smiled, a smile so like Elizabeth's, it made Alexander's heart ache. "That's why she taught me this." Before Victor could react, Sarah pressed a sequence of buttons on her wheelchair's armrest, buttons that hadn't been there moments before. The maintenance room's lights flickered, and a high-pitched tone filled the air. Victor's men clutched their heads as their sonic mapping equipment went haywire, feeding back through their earpieces. In the confusion, Alexander saw their chance. He scooped Sarah from her wheelchair, the notebook tucked safely in his jacket, and dove for the elevator. The doors slid shut just as Victor lunged forward, his composed facade finally cracking. The elevator began to descend, taking them deeper than Alexander would have thought possible. "Mom called it the resonance defense," Sarah explained, still holding tight to Alexander. "The wheelchair wasn't bugged by Victor's men. She designed it to attract their trackers, to lead them exactly where she wanted them. And now..." The tablet in Alexander's pocket lit up with a final message from Claire. "Sanctuary protocols activated. Outer entrance sealed. You're safe now. The real work is about to begin." As the elevator continued its descent, Sarah opened her notebook to a page Alexander hadn't seen before. On it was a drawing of a place that looked like a cross between a school and a research facility, filled with children learning to understand and develop their unique gifts. At the top of the page, in Elizabeth's handwriting, was a simple title: "Welcome to the Sanctuary, where different minds shape the future." The elevator doors opened to reveal a sight that took Alexander's breath away. The sanctuary was unlike anything he could have imagined, a vast underground complex that somehow managed to feel warm and welcoming despite its location. Natural-looking light filtered down from what appeared to be sophisticated light wells, and the walls were painted in soothing colors that seemed to shift subtly as they watched. "Mom called it responsive architecture," Sarah explained, her eyes bright with excitement. "The whole place is designed to adapt to the people inside it. The colors, the sounds, even the air circulation, it all changes based on what we need." As Alexander carried Sarah into the main atrium, they were greeted by a holographic interface that materialized in front of them. "Welcome, Sarah Blackwood Morgan and Alexander Morgan," a gentle voice announced. "Primary protocols initiating. Would you like a tour of the facilities?" "Yes, please," Sarah responded without hesitation. "And is there a wheelchair available?" A panel in the wall slid open, revealing a sleek, modern wheelchair that looked nothing like the one they'd left behind. Elizabeth Morgan ensured all necessary accommodations would be ready, the voice informed them. "This model is customized to your specifications, Sarah." Alexander carefully settled Sarah into the new wheelchair, noting how perfectly it fit her. Even here, Elizabeth had thought of everything. The chair responded to Sarah's touch instantly, allowing her to move with unprecedented ease. "This is amazing," Sarah breathed, testing the chair's capabilities. "It's like it knows exactly what I want it to do." "The interface is pattern-based," the facility's AI explained. "It adapts to your unique cognitive processing style. Elizabeth designed it specifically for children with your genetic profile." As they moved through the facility, Alexander began to understand the true scope of Elizabeth's vision. The sanctuary wasn't just a hiding place, it was a complete educational and research center. They passed classrooms equipped with interactive learning systems, research laboratories with cutting-edge equipment, and common areas designed to foster collaboration and creativity. "There are others like me," Sarah said, pointing to a wall of photographs. "Look!" The wall displayed images of children and young adults, each with a brief description of their unique pattern recognition abilities. Some could see mathematical relationships in nature, others could decode complex languages instantly, and still others could predict patterns in everything from weather systems to social behaviors. Elizabeth was building a community, Alexander realized, a place where these abilities could be understood and developed safely. They entered what appeared to be a central control room, its walls lined with monitors showing various parts of the facility. One screen displayed a news feed. The legacy protocol's data release was already making waves. Headlines scrolled. Past, groundbreaking genetic research revealed. Pattern recognition abilities, the next step in human evolution. The tablet in Alexander's pocket chimed with a message from Claire. Victor's been detained by federal agents. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. But we have a new challenge. Families are already reaching out. They've seen the news. They're looking for answers about their children. Sarah wheeled herself to one of the control panels, her fingers moving confidently over the interface. Mom left protocols for this too. Look, there are satellite facilities all over the world, hidden just like this one, each one ready to activate when needed. A map appeared on the main screen, showing a network of connected sites. The Sanctuary wasn't alone. It was part of a larger system designed to protect and nurture children with these unique abilities. But why keep it hidden for so long? Alexander wondered aloud. Why not reveal everything sooner? Because of this, Sarah said, accessing a secured file. Elizabeth's face appeared on the screen, looking more serious than in her previous messages. If you're seeing this, Elizabeth's recording began, then the time has finally come. The Sanctuary isn't just a school or a research facility, it's a proving ground. These children, with their extraordinary abilities, will face unique challenges. The world needs to be ready to understand them, to accept them, and they need to be ready to use their gifts responsibly. The recording continued, explaining how Elizabeth had spent years preparing not just the facility, but a complete support system, legal frameworks to protect the children's rights, educational programs to help them develop their abilities, and security measures to prevent their gifts from being exploited. James would have loved this place, Alexander said softly, watching as Sarah explored more of the facility's systems. He helped create it, Sarah replied, pulling up another file. Look, these base codes, the fundamental patterns that run everything, they're based on James's drawings. Mom used his way of seeing the world as the foundation for all of this. Alexander felt tears prick at his eyes. Even after all this time, his son was still helping to protect and guide others like him. A new alert flashed across the screens. Security systems had detected movement in the tunnels above. But this time it wasn't a threat. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah announced, checking the security feed, and she's not alone. The cameras showed their trusted housekeeper leading a small group through the secure entrance, a mother and father with a young boy who moved his hands in familiar patterns, seeing the world in ways only a few could understand. The first of many, the facility's AI commented. Sanctuary protocols are designed to accommodate up to 300 residents initially, with expansion capabilities as needed. Sarah looked up at Alexander, her eyes shining with purpose. Mom always said that understanding comes in patterns. First one, then another, until suddenly everyone can see the bigger picture. Alexander placed his hand on her shoulder, watching. As Mrs. Henderson and the new arrivals made their way through the intake procedures Elizabeth had designed so carefully. Then I suppose it's time we help them see it, he said. The sanctuary's systems hummed with life around them, ready to begin its true purpose, not just protecting these extraordinary children, but helping them thrive. And somewhere, Alexander was certain Elizabeth was smiling. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as the sanctuary came fully to life. More families arrived, each with their own stories of children who saw the world differently. Alexander watched in amazement as Sarah naturally fell into the role of guide, helping newcomers understand the facility's pattern-based systems with an ease that reminded him powerfully of Elizabeth. Claire had taken charge of the legal aspects, working with a team of trusted advocates to establish protections for the children and their families. The Legacy Protocol's release had sparked intense international interest, but the sanctuary's security systems, designed by Elizabeth, kept their actual location secure while allowing them to communicate safely with the outside world. It's like a whole new kind of family, Sarah observed one evening, as they watched several children working together in one of the common areas. They were using the interactive walls to visualize complex patterns that only they could fully comprehend, their hands moving in synchronized motions that created stunning mathematical artwork. Your mother built all this, Alexander said, But she made sure it would need all of us to make it work. Every person here brings something unique to the pattern. Mrs. Henderson approached them, carrying a tablet with the latest security updates. She had seamlessly transitioned from housekeeper to the sanctuary's head of operations, revealing skills that Elizabeth had clearly recognized years ago. "The new family from Seattle has arrived," she reported. "Their daughter started seeing patterns in weather systems when she was 4. She's already helping us improve our environmental controls." She smiled warmly at Sarah. "Would you like to welcome them?" Sarah nodded eagerly, but before she could move, another alert appeared on the main screens. One of the satellite facilities had activated, this one in a remote part of Norway. "Mum's network is growing," Sarah said proudly, watching as new points of light appeared on the global map. Each facility is different, designed for the specific needs of its region, but they're all connected by the same underlying patterns. Alexander studied the expanding network displayed before them. Elizabeth hadn't just created a refuge, she'd designed a whole new kind of global community. The sanctuary was becoming exactly what she had envisioned, a place where being different wasn't just accepted, but celebrated. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission from Claire. Her face appeared on one of the smaller screens, her expression both serious and hopeful. "The International Education Committee has approved our curriculum proposal," she announced. "We can officially begin registering the sanctuary as a specialized learning center." "But there's something else, something about James." Sarah wheeled closer to the screen, Alexander right beside her. Claire held up a file that made Alexander's heart skip a beat. It was James's old medical records. "Elizabeth left these, encrypted in a separate system," Claire explained. "She knew we'd find them when the time was right. James wasn't just drawing patterns, Alexander. He was mapping them. Every sketch, every puzzle he created. They're all part of a larger design. A design that's still growing." The screens around them suddenly came alive with James's drawings, digitally enhanced and connected in ways they'd never seen before. Sarah gasped as the patterns began to move, evolving and combining to reveal something extraordinary. "It's a teaching tool," she whispered, her hands moving instinctively to match the flowing patterns. James wasn't just seeing the patterns, he was creating a way to help others understand them. Mom used his work as the foundation, but she knew it would take another generation to complete it. Alexander watched in awe as his son's legacy merged with the sanctuary's systems, creating new ways for the children to explore and develop their abilities. Even now, years later, James was helping to guide and protect others like him. Mrs. Henderson discreetly wiped away a tear as she watched the patterns dance across the screens. "Elizabeth always said that love leaves its own kind of pattern," she said softly, "one that continues long after we're gone." A gentle alert sound drew their attention to the entrance area. The new family from Seattle had arrived, their young daughter already tracing patterns in the air that matched the facility's responsive architecture perfectly. "Would you like to show them around?" Alexander asked Sarah, seeing the same welcoming spirit in her that had made Elizabeth such a remarkable person. Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with purpose. "Mom always said the best way to understand a pattern is to help someone else see it." She turned her wheelchair toward the entrance, then looked back at Alexander. "Coming, Dad?" The word hung in the air between them, the first time she had called him that. Alexander felt his heart swell with emotion as he followed her, watching as she prepared to welcome another family into the extraordinary world Elizabeth had created. Through the facility's light wells, the afternoon sun created shifting patterns on the floors and walls. To most eyes, they would appear random, beautiful, but meaningless. But for the special children of the sanctuary, they were messages of hope, reminding them that they were not alone, that their unique way of seeing the world was not just accepted here, it was the key to unlocking humanity's next great adventure. And somewhere in those patterns, Alexander was certain Elizabeth and James were watching, their legacy living on in every child who found their way home to the sanctuary. 1 month after the sanctuary's activation, the underground facility had transformed from a hidden refuge into a thriving community. The once quiet halls now echoed with the sounds of children exploring their abilities, guided by a growing team of specialists who had been carefully vetted and brought into Elizabeth's vision. Alexander stood in his new office, watching through a specially designed observation window as Sarah led a group session in the Pattern Recognition Center. She had taken to her role as peer mentor with natural grace, helping new arrivals understand their unique abilities while continuing to discover the depths of her own talents. "She's remarkable," Claire said, joining him at the window. "Just like Elizabeth was at that age." She handed him a tablet displaying the latest data from their global network. 3 more facilities have come online this week. The pattern is spreading exactly as Elizabeth predicted. The tablet showed clusters of activity across continents, children with extraordinary abilities being identified, protected, and guided toward their nearest sanctuary facility. What had started as a hidden refuge was becoming a global movement, carefully managed to protect the children while helping the world understand and accept their gifts. "Victor's trial begins next week," Claire continued, her voice carefully neutral. "The evidence from the legacy protocol has been independently verified by multiple research institutions. His attempts to control and exploit these abilities have been fully exposed." Alexander nodded, remembering the man's face when he realized his plans had backfired. Victor had sought to manipulate these extraordinary children for his own gain, but Elizabeth's careful planning had transformed his research into a foundation for understanding and nurturing their gifts instead. A soft chime from the facility's AI system interrupted their conversation. "Mr. Morgan, Sarah is requesting your presence in the archives. She says she's found something important in James's old drawings." The archives had become Sarah's favorite place in the sanctuary, a vast digital library where Elizabeth had stored decades of research, personal notes, and family histories. But it was James's artwork that drew Sarah back again and again, each visit revealing new layers of meaning in her brother's intricate patterns. Alexander found Sarah surrounded by holographic displays of James's drawings, her wheelchair positioned at the center of what looked like a complex 3-dimensional puzzle. "Dad," she called excitedly, "look at this." Her hands moved through the projected images, manipulating them with practiced ease. James wasn't just drawing patterns, he was creating a language, a way for people like us to communicate that goes beyond words. The drawings shifted and flowed around them, responding to Sarah's guidance. Simple sketches that had once seemed like a child's artwork revealed themselves as components of a sophisticated visual communication system. "Your mother suspected this," Alexander said softly, watching as Sarah demonstrated how different elements combined to convey complex concepts. She wrote about it in her research notes, how James seemed to be reaching for something just beyond traditional language. Sarah nodded eagerly. "And now we can teach it to others. Look!" She gestured to another display, where several children, in one of the satellite facilities, were using similar patterns to share ideas across language barriers. "It's like James created the foundation, and now we're building on it." The door opened to admit Mrs. Henderson, who had exchanged her housekeeper's uniform for the more practical attire of the sanctuary's administrative director. "I hate to interrupt," she said, "but the new family from Tokyo has arrived. Their twins are showing remarkable abilities with musical patterns." Sarah's eyes lit up. "The ones who can see sound waves." When Mrs. Henderson nodded, Sarah was already turning her wheelchair toward the door. "Their abilities might help us understand more about James's sound-based security systems." Alexander watched her go, marveling at how naturally she had stepped into her role as both student and teacher. The sanctuary wasn't just preserving Elizabeth's legacy, it was growing beyond anything they could have imagined. A notification appeared on the main screen. Another message from one of Elizabeth's time-locked files had become available. These periodic revelations had become a source of guidance and comfort, Elizabeth's foresight continuing to light their path forward. "I always knew this day would come," Elizabeth's recorded image said softly, "when our children would not only understand their gifts, but help others embrace their own unique ways of seeing the world." The patterns James saw, the ones Sarah now helps others discover, they're more than just different ways of processing information. They're windows into possibilities we're only beginning to understand. As the message played, Alexander noticed something new in the background of Elizabeth's recording, a drawing on her wall that matched one currently displayed in the archives. The connection across time was striking, mother and son working separately but in harmony toward the same goal. She knew, Sarah said, having wheeled back quietly to watch the message. Mom knew that understanding these patterns would take more than one generation. That's why she built all of this, not just to protect us, but to give us time to grow into our abilities naturally. Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of Elizabeth's trust and the promise of the future she had helped create. And now you're helping make her dream reality. Outside the archives, the sounds of children exploring their gifts echoed through the sanctuary's halls. Each day brought new discoveries, new patterns to understand, new ways of seeing the world that would have been suppressed or exploited without Elizabeth's intervention. "Dad," Sarah said suddenly, her hands moving to create a new pattern in the holographic display, "I think I know what James was trying to show us about the music box. It wasn't just a security system, it was the key to something bigger." The pattern she created seemed to pulse with possibility, waiting to reveal yet another layer of the extraordinary legacy they had inherited. Sarah's discovery about James's music box set off a chain of revelations that transformed their understanding of the sanctuary's capabilities. The simple melody that had seemed like a childhood comfort was actually part of a sophisticated communication network, embedding messages in harmonics that only those with their unique abilities could fully perceive. "It's beautiful," whispered Hana, one of the newly arrived twins from Tokyo, as she and her sister Yuki helped Sarah explore the musical patterns. Their ability to visualize sound waves added a new dimension to James's work, revealing layers of meaning hidden within the harmonics. Alexander watched from the observation room as the three girls worked together, their different abilities complementing each other in ways Elizabeth must have anticipated. The facility's AI system responded to their discoveries, incorporating new patterns into its adaptive architecture. "The children are advancing faster than we expected," Claire noted, reviewing the latest progress reports. "Their collaborative learning style is accelerating everyone's development." Elizabeth's prediction models were right again. The walls of the sanctuary seemed to pulse gently with new energy as the children's understanding grew. What had started as a security system was evolving into something more, a way for the facility itself to communicate with its special residents. Mrs. Henderson entered with another update from the global network. The satellite facilities are reporting similar breakthroughs. Children are spontaneously developing their own pattern languages, but they all seem to be compatible with James's original system. "It's as if they're all parts of the same conversation," Sarah finished, wheeling into the room with Hana and Yuki following. Mom didn't just build separate safe houses, she created connection points. The sanctuaries are nodes in a larger pattern. Alexander recognized the excitement in Sarah's voice. It was the same tone Elizabeth had used when making a breakthrough in her research. "Show me," he said, moving to the main control center. Sarah guided her wheelchair to the central console, while Hana and Yuki took positions at auxiliary stations. Together, they began inputting the musical patterns they'd discovered, translating them into visual forms that spread across the facility's neural network. The effect was immediate and stunning. The sanctuary's responsive architecture began resonating with new frequencies, creating harmonic patterns that linked with other facilities around the world. On the main screen, they could see similar responses occurring globally. Children in different sanctuaries simultaneously discovering and connecting through this hidden language. Elizabeth called it the Harmony Protocol, Claire said, accessing a newly unlocked file. She theorized that these abilities weren't just individual traits, but parts of a larger evolutionary development. The children aren't just recognizing patterns, they're participating in them, adding their own voices to a growing symphony of human consciousness. As if in response to Claire's words, a new message from Elizabeth appeared on the screens, but this one was different. Instead of a video recording, it was a complex pattern that combined visual, musical, and mathematical elements. Sarah gasped softly. "It's not just a message, it's an invitation. Mom left us a path to follow, but she wanted us to complete it ourselves. Each discovery we make adds to the pattern, makes it clearer. The facility's AI system began integrating the new information, its displays showing how each child's unique perspective contributed to their collective understanding. James's original drawings, Sarah's interpretations, the twins' musical insights, all were parts of an emerging whole. Your mother believed that humanity was on the cusp of a new way of perceiving reality, Mrs. Henderson said, reading from Elizabeth's research notes. These children aren't anomalies. They're pioneers showing us possibilities we never imagined. Alexander watched as Sarah worked with her new friends, their different abilities harmonizing to unlock more of the facility's potential. He saw James in her focused expression, Elizabeth in her patient guidance of others. The legacy of both his children lived on in this place, growing and evolving in ways that filled him with wonder. "Dad," Sarah called, her eyes bright with discovery. "I think I understand what Mom meant about the bigger picture. The sanctuary isn't just a school or a refuge, it's an instrument. We're learning to play it together, creating something entirely new." The twins nodded in agreement, their hands moving in synchronized patterns that the facility's systems translated into beautiful, complex harmonies. Around them, other children began gathering, drawn by the music and light, each adding their own unique perspective to the emerging symphony. "Elizabeth knew this would happen," Claire said softly. "She built all of this not just to protect the children, but to give them a place to discover their true potential together." Through the facility's light wells, the afternoon sun created dancing patterns that seemed to move in harmony with the children's discoveries. The sanctuary was coming alive in ways they were only beginning to understand, each day bringing new revelations about the extraordinary legacy Elizabeth had left them. As Alexander watched Sarah guide another group of newcomers through their first pattern recognition exercises, he realized that their story wasn't ending. It was transforming, becoming part of something larger and more wonderful than any of them had imagined. The patterns James had seen, the protections Elizabeth had built, the connections Sarah was helping others discover, they were all threads in a tapestry that was still being woven, a symphony still being composed. And somewhere, in the harmony of it all, he could feel the love that had inspired it all, echoing through the sanctuary's halls like a perpetual lullaby. 3 months into the sanctuary's operation, an unexpected discovery changed everything. It began during one of Sarah's collaborative sessions with Hannah and Yuki, as they worked to understand the deeper implications of James's musical patterns. "There's something else here," Hannah said, her fingers tracing invisible waves in the air. "The harmonics aren't just communicating, they're reaching for something." Sarah wheeled closer to the holographic display, where the twins' sound visualization merged with her pattern recognition interface. The facility's AI system had been tracking their progress, noting how different abilities seemed to resonate with each other in increasingly complex ways. "It's like ripples in a pond," Yuki added, her hands moving in synchronization with her. "Sisters, but instead of spreading out, they're converging, leading somewhere." Alexander entered the Pattern Recognition Center just as the girls made their breakthrough. The room's responsive architecture was pulsing with new energy, the walls themselves seeming to vibrate in harmony with the children's discoveries. "Dad, look at this!" Sarah's excitement was palpable as she manipulated the holographic display. "Remember how Mom's message said the sanctuaries were nodes in a larger pattern? We thought it was just about communication, but it's more than that." The main screen filled with a 3-dimensional representation of the global sanctuary network. Each facility appeared as a point of light, connected by threads of energy that pulsed in time with the harmonics the children were exploring. "They're not just connected," Sarah explained, her hands moving through the display with practiced ease. "They're synchronized. Each facility's unique resonance contributes to a larger pattern, one that James began mapping years ago." Claire arrived with Mrs. Henderson, both drawn by the unusual energy readings their systems were detecting. "Elizabeth's latest time-locked file just unlocked," Claire announced. "I think she knew this moment would come." The recording appeared on the main screen, but this time Elizabeth wasn't alone. A young James sat beside her, his hands moving, over what looked like an early prototype of the sanctuary's interface system. "If you're seeing this," Elizabeth began, then the children have discovered what James first sensed years ago. These abilities, this different way of seeing and understanding patterns, it's more than just an evolutionary development. It's a key. The recording showed James working with the prototype, his drawings and musical compositions, creating patterns that seemed to reach beyond the visible spectrum. He called it the echo chamber, Elizabeth continued, a space where different perceptions could merge, creating something entirely new. Sarah's eyes widened as she made the connection. The sanctuary isn't just a shelter or a school, she whispered. It's an instrument, a way to focus and amplify our abilities, and when all the facilities work in harmony, they create a resonance field that can potentially change how we perceive reality itself, Claire finished, reading from Elizabeth's newly unlocked research notes. She believed that these children weren't just seeing patterns differently, they were accessing aspects of existence that most humans never perceive. The twins moved to different control stations, their ability to visualize sound waves adding new dimensions to the facility's harmonic matrix. Other children began gathering, drawn by the unusual energies pulsing through the sanctuary's systems. James knew, Sarah said softly, studying her brother's movements in the recording. He wasn't just creating security systems or communication networks. He was trying to show us something bigger, something he could sense but couldn't fully explain. Alexander watched as the children naturally organized themselves around the room, each contributing their unique perspective to the emerging pattern. A child who saw mathematical relationships in nature worked alongside another who could visualize electromagnetic fields. A girl who understood weather patterns collaborated with a boy who could predict seismic vibrations. The facility's AI system adapted to their combined inputs, creating a harmonious interface that allowed their different perceptions to merge and amplify each other. The effect was extraordinary. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. Elizabeth called it the convergence protocol, Mrs. Henderson said, accessing another set of encrypted files. The final stage of the sanctuary's evolution, when enough children learned to combine their abilities, she believed they could achieve something unprecedented. On the main screen, the global network of sanctuaries pulsed with synchronized energy. Reports began coming in from other facilities. Children around the world were experiencing similar breakthroughs, their combined abilities creating a web of consciousness that transcended traditional boundaries. Mom built all of this, Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. Not just to protect us, but to prepare us. She knew that understanding these patterns would take more than one person, more than one generation. It would take all of us working together, seeing things in different ways but contributing to the same greater purpose. Alexander moved to stand beside his daughter, watching as she coordinated with the twins and other children, their combined abilities bringing the sanctuary to life in ways they were only beginning to understand. In Sarah's focused expression, he saw echoes of both Elizabeth's vision and James's intuitive grasp of hidden patterns. Through the facility's light wells, the afternoon sun created new patterns that seemed to dance in harmony with the children's discoveries. The sanctuary was no longer just a refuge, it was becoming a gateway to understanding the world in entirely new ways. And somewhere in the complex harmonies and intricate patterns they were creating, Alexander felt the presence of his entire family, Elizabeth's brilliant foresight, James's profound insight, and Sarah's natural ability to bring people together, all combining to reveal something extraordinary. The next phase of their journey was just beginning. The breakthrough in the Pattern Recognition Center sparked a wave of revelations across the global network of sanctuaries, as children in different facilities learned to combine their unique perspectives. They began to access levels of understanding that Elizabeth had only theorized about in her research. It's like a universal language, Sarah explained to a group of new arrivals, her wheelchair positioned at the center of the sanctuary's main hub. But instead of words, we're using patterns that exist in everything: music, mathematics, nature, even time itself. The facility's walls rippled with dynamic energy as Hannah and Yuki demonstrated how their sound visualization abilities could interact with other children's gifts. A young boy from Brazil who could see patterns in plant growth worked with a girl from Kenya who understood the mathematical structures of crystal formation. Together, they created stunning displays of harmony between different natural phenomena. Alexander watched from the observation deck, accompanied by Claire and Mrs. Henderson. Elizabeth's research suggests this is just the beginning, Claire said, reviewing the latest data. As more children learn to combine their abilities, their collective understanding grows exponentially. Mrs. Henderson nodded, her expression thoughtful. The legal teams have finished processing Victor's assets. Everything has been transferred to the Sanctuary Foundation, just as Elizabeth planned. The children will have all the resources they need to continue developing their abilities. A soft chime announced another unlocked message from Elizabeth, but this time, the message manifested as a complex pattern of light and sound that filled the main chamber. The children instinctively responded, their combined abilities allowing them to perceive and interact with the multi-layered communication. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her hands moving through the holographic display. "Mom found a way to speak to us that goes beyond normal language. She's showing us how all our different ways of seeing things are connected." The pattern expanded as more children joined in, each adding their unique perspective to the collective experience. Through their combined abilities, they began to understand what Elizabeth had discovered, that the patterns they could see were part of a deeper reality, one that most people never perceived. "James was the first to sense it," Alexander said, watching as Sarah guided the younger children through the experience. His drawings, his music, he was trying to map something that existed between the normal ways of perceiving the world. The facility's AI system adapted to the children's growing understanding, creating new interfaces that allowed them to explore and combine their abilities in increasingly sophisticated ways. The sanctuary itself seemed to evolve with them, its responsive architecture becoming more attuned to the subtle harmonies they were discovering. "Look at this," Sarah called excitedly, directing their attention to a new pattern emerging on the main display. "When we combine everyone's perspectives, we can see connections we never noticed before. It's like..." She paused, searching for the right words. "Like we're learning to read the universe's own language." Claire accessed another set of Elizabeth's research notes. She predicted this. She called it harmonic synthesis, the ability to perceive and interact with the fundamental patterns that underlie reality itself. The twins moved to join Sarah, their combined abilities creating a fascinating demonstration of how sound waves could interact with other natural phenomena. The other children watched in amazement as visible patterns of light and energy danced in response to their harmonic manipulations. "Each child brings their own unique way of seeing things," Mrs. Henderson observed, "but together, they're creating something entirely new, something that couldn't exist without their collaboration." Alexander felt a profound sense of pride and wonder as he watched Sarah work with the other children. She had inherited not just Elizabeth's brilliance and James's insight, but also their desire to help others understand and develop their gifts. The facility's systems hummed with energy as the children continued their exploration. Reports from other sanctuaries showed similar breakthroughs occurring worldwide, creating a network of understanding that transcended traditional boundaries of communication and perception. "Mom knew this would happen," Sarah said, looking up at Alexander with eyes bright with purpose. "She built the sanctuary not just as a safe place, but as a starting point. She wanted us to discover who we really are and what we can become when we work together." Through the facility's light wells, the setting sun cast golden patterns that seemed to dance in harmony with the children's discoveries. The sanctuary had become more than just a refuge or a school. It was a gateway to understanding the world in ways that would have once seemed impossible. As Alexander watched his daughter guide another group through their first experience of harmonic synthesis, he realized that Elizabeth's legacy was still unfolding. The patterns James had seen, the potential Elizabeth had nurtured, and the community Sarah was helping to build were all part of something larger than any of them had imagined. The future they were creating together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. 6 months after the sanctuary's activation, the facility had evolved beyond anything its residents could have imagined. The children's combined abilities had transformed the underground complex into something that defied conventional understanding. a space where different perceptions of reality could merge and interact in extraordinary ways. Sarah sat in her customized wheelchair at the center of what they now called the Harmony Chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing the intricate web of connections linking all sanctuary facilities worldwide. Hana and Yuki worked at adjacent stations, their ability to visualize sound waves adding new dimensions to the complex patterns they were all learning to navigate. "There's something we're still missing," Sarah said, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that the facility's systems translated into visible energy flows. All these connections, all these different ways of seeing things, they're leading somewhere. Mom left us one final message, but it's hidden in the patterns themselves. Alexander watched from his usual spot near the observation window, remembering how Elizabeth had always said that the most important truths were often hidden in plain sight. The facility's responsive architecture seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the very walls were aware of approaching revelation. "Look at this," called Maya, a 12-year-old girl who could see patterns in temporal flows. She had been working with the historical data from James's original drawings. When we overlay the timing of everyone's discoveries, they form their own pattern. It's like a countdown. Claire approached with the latest reports from the global network. The other facilities are reporting similar findings. The children's abilities aren't just growing stronger, they're synchronizing across continents, creating harmonies we never thought possible. Mrs. Henderson entered the chamber, carrying Elizabeth's final research journal, the one that had only recently been unlocked by the facility's time-sealed protocols. "There's something here about what she called the Grand Harmony," she said, her voice thoughtful. "A state where all the different patterns we can perceive come together to reveal something unprecedented." Sarah wheeled over to examine the journal, her eyes scanning the complex equations and diagrams that filled its pages. "These look like James's drawings," she said excitedly, "but they're more than just patterns. They're instructions. Mom found a way to combine everyone's different perspectives into something entirely new." The twins moved to their stations, beginning a harmonic sequence that they had developed with Sarah. Other children joined in, each adding their unique perception to the growing symphony of patterns. The facility's systems responded, creating visual and auditory representations of their combined insights. "It's beautiful," Alexander said softly, watching as the children's different abilities merged and flowed together. The patterns they created seemed to reach beyond the visible spectrum, touching something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. Sarah's hands moved confidently over her control panel, coordinating the various inputs. "Mom didn't just build this place to protect us," she explained, her voice filled with wonder. "She created it to help us understand who we really are, what we can become when we work together." A new pattern began to emerge on the main display, one that combined elements from all their different perspectives. Mathematical sequences, merged with sound waves, temporal flows intertwined with crystal structures, and weather patterns harmonized with electromagnetic fields. "Look at how it all connects," Maya observed, her temporal sensitivity allowing her to see how the pattern evolved through time. "It's like every discovery we've made was leading us to this moment." The facility's AI system chimed softly, announcing the arrival of another time-locked message from Elizabeth. But this one was different. Instead of appearing on a screen, it manifested as a complex harmonic pattern that resonated through the entire chamber. Mom found a way to encode information in the harmony itself, Sarah realized, her hands moving through the holographic display. She knew that when we were ready, when we had learned to combine our abilities in the right way, we would be able to perceive it. As the children worked together, their combined abilities allowing them to decode Elizabeth's hidden message, Alexander felt a profound sense of completion. Everything, the patterns James had seen, the protections Elizabeth had built, the community Sarah had helped create, was coming together in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. The main chamber filled with swirling patterns of light and energy as the children's harmonized abilities reached new levels of sophistication. Through their combined perspectives, they began to perceive aspects of reality that had always existed but had remained hidden from conventional observation. This is what Mum was working toward, Sarah said, her eyes shining with purpose. Not just understanding these patterns, but learning to work with them, to use them to see the world in entirely new ways. Through the facility's light wells, the afternoon sun created dancing patterns that seemed to respond to the children's discoveries. The sanctuary had become more than just a safe haven or a school. It was a gateway to understanding the universe in ways that would have once seemed impossible. As Alexander watched his daughter guide another group through their first experience of harmonic synthesis, he realized that Elizabeth's legacy was still unfolding. The patterns James had mapped, the potential Elizabeth had protected, and the community Sarah was helping to build were all part of something larger than any of them had imagined. The future they were creating together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. As the children worked to decode Elizabeth's harmonic message, the sanctuary's systems began to respond in unprecedented ways. The facility's responsive architecture resonated with new frequencies, creating visual and auditory patterns that seemed to bridge the gap between different ways of perceiving reality. "It's like the whole building is singing," Yuki observed, her hands moving in sync with the flowing energies. Her sister Hana nodded in agreement, their combined ability to visualize sound waves revealing layers of harmony that others were only beginning to understand. Sarah guided her wheelchair through the complex patterns, her natural ability to recognize and integrate different perspectives, making her the perfect coordinator for their combined efforts. The other children followed her lead, each contributing their unique insights to the growing symphony of understanding. "Mum's message isn't just information," Sarah explained, her fingers dancing across the holographic controls. "It's a key, a way to unlock something that's been here all along, waiting for us to be ready to perceive it." Alexander stood with Claire and Mrs. Henderson, watching as the children's abilities transformed the main chamber into something that defied conventional description. Patterns of light and energy flowed and merged, creating structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could see. "Elizabeth's final research notes mentioned something about this," Claire said, consulting her tablet. "She called it the revelation, a state where different perceptions of reality could merge to reveal fundamental truths about the nature of existence itself." Mrs. Henderson smiled softly, remembering conversations with Elizabeth from years ago. "She always said that children like Sarah and James weren't limited by conventional ways of seeing the world. Their unique perspectives weren't disabilities, they were evolutionary advantages, allowing them to perceive aspects of reality that most people never notice." The facility's AI system adapted to the children's growing understanding, creating new interfaces that allowed them to explore and combine their abilities in increasingly sophisticated ways. The sanctuary itself seemed to evolve with them, its systems becoming more attuned to the subtle harmonies they were discovering. "Look at this," Maya called out, her temporal sensitivity revealing new patterns in the flow of events. "Everything we've learned, every discovery we've made, they're all connected, like pieces of a symphony that's been playing all along, waiting for us to learn how to hear it." Sarah coordinated with the twins and other children, their combined abilities, creating something that transcended individual perception. Through their harmonized efforts, Elizabeth's message began to take shape, not as words or images, but as a direct understanding that reached beyond conventional communication. "She found a way to show us," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "Not just tell us, but show us what's possible when we learn to see beyond our usual limitations." The main chamber filled with swirling patterns of light and energy as the children's harmonized abilities reached new levels of sophistication. Through their combined perspectives, they began to perceive aspects of reality that had always existed, but had remained hidden from conventional observation. Alexander moved to stand beside his daughter, watching as she guided the younger children through this extraordinary experience. In her focused expression, he saw echoes of both Elizabeth's visionary brilliance and James's intuitive understanding of hidden patterns. "Your mother knew this day would come," he said softly. "She built all of this not just to protect you, but to give you the time and space you needed to discover your true potential." The facility's systems hummed with energy as more children joined in the harmonic exploration. Reports from other sanctuaries showed similar breakthroughs occurring worldwide, creating a network of understanding that transcended traditional boundaries of communication and perception. Through the facility's light wells, the setting sun cast golden patterns that seemed to dance in harmony with the children's discoveries. The sanctuary had become more than just a refuge or a school. It was a gateway to understanding the world in ways that would have once seemed impossible. As the day drew to a close, Sarah looked up at her father with eyes bright with purpose. "Mom left us more than just a legacy," she said. "She left us a beginning, a way to see the world as it really is, full of patterns and possibilities that most people never notice." Alexander nodded, feeling the truth of her words in the very air around them. The sanctuary wasn't just a place of safety or learning. It was a promise of what humanity could become when it learned to embrace different ways of seeing and understanding the world. The future they were creating together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. And somewhere, in the complex harmonies and intricate patterns they were discovering, Alexander felt the presence of his entire family: Elizabeth's brilliant foresight, James's profound insight, and Sarah's natural ability to bring people together, all combining to reveal something extraordinary. The next chapter of their journey was just beginning, and it promised to be more amazing than any of them could have imagined. 1 year after the sanctuary's activation, the facility had become a beacon of hope for children with extraordinary abilities around the world. The breakthrough that Sarah and the others had achieved with Elizabeth's harmonic message had opened doors to understanding that transformed not just their lives, but the very way they perceived reality. The main chamber, now known as the Resonance Hall, buzzed with activity as children from different sanctuaries collaborated through their advanced harmonic interface systems. Sarah, who had grown into her role as lead coordinator with Natural, Grace, guided a group of newcomers through their first experience of pattern synthesis. "Everyone sees the world differently," she explained, her wheelchair moving smoothly between the holographic displays. "What makes this place special is that we learn to combine our perspectives, to understand how all our different ways of seeing things are part of a larger picture." Alexander watched from the observation deck, accompanied by Claire and Mrs. Henderson. The facility's responsive architecture had evolved with the children's growing abilities, creating an environment that could adapt instantly to their needs and discoveries. "The latest reports from the global network are extraordinary," Claire said, reviewing data on her tablet. "The children's combined abilities are revealing patterns in everything from climate systems to social dynamics. They're helping us understand the world in ways we never imagined possible." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Elizabeth would be proud. She always said that these children weren't just different. They were pioneers, showing us possibilities that most people never even dream of." The twins, Hana and Yuki, worked at their customized stations, their sound visualization abilities now integrated seamlessly with the sanctuary's systems. Their work had led to breakthroughs in understanding how different types of patterns, visual, auditory, mathematical, temporal, were all interconnected. "Look at this," Maya called from her temporal analysis station. "When we map the flow of discoveries across all sanctuaries, it creates its own pattern. It's like we're part of a larger rhythm, each discovery building on the others in perfect harmony." Sarah wheeled over to examine Maya's findings, her hands moving through the holographic display with practiced ease. "Mom knew this would happen," she said softly. "She built the sanctuary, not just as a safe place, but as a starting point for something bigger." The facility's AI system chimed, announcing the arrival of another time-locked message from Elizabeth. These messages had become less frequent but more profound, each one revealing new layers of her vision for the sanctuary's future. This time, the message manifested as a complex harmonic pattern that filled the entire chamber. The children instinctively responded, their combined abilities allowing them to perceive and interact with the multi-layered communication in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. "She's showing us the next step," Sarah explained, coordinating the others as they worked to decode the pattern. "All these different abilities, all these ways of seeing the world, they're coming together to reveal something extraordinary. Through their combined perspectives, they began to understand what Elizabeth had discovered years ago, that reality itself was far more complex and interconnected than most people realized. The patterns they could perceive were like threads in an infinite tapestry, each one connected to countless others in ways that only their unique abilities could reveal. Alexander moved to stand beside his daughter, watching as she guided the younger children through the experience. In her focused expression, he saw echoes of both Elizabeth's visionary brilliance and James's intuitive understanding of hidden patterns. "Your mother built all of this," he said softly, "but you and the others are taking it beyond anything she could have imagined. You're not just seeing the patterns anymore. You're learning to work with them, to understand them in ways that could change everything." The facility's systems hummed with energy as more children joined in the harmonic exploration. Reports from other sanctuaries showed similar breakthroughs occurring worldwide, creating a network of understanding that transcended traditional boundaries of communication and perception. Through the light wells, the afternoon sun created patterns that seemed to dance in harmony with the children's discoveries. The sanctuary had become more than just a refuge or a school. It was a gateway to understanding the world in ways that would have once seemed impossible. "We're just beginning to understand what's possible," Sarah said, her eyes bright with purpose. "Mom gave us the foundation, but what we build from here depends on all of us working together." As the day drew to a close, the sanctuary systems pulsed with new energy, responding to the children's growing abilities in ways that suggested even greater discoveries ahead. The patterns they were learning to perceive and understand were leading them towards something unprecedented, a new way of seeing and interacting with the world that could benefit all of humanity. Alexander watched as Sarah coordinated another group experiment, her natural leadership abilities shining through. The future they were creating together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. The sanctuary's main chamber filled with swirling patterns of light and energy as the children prepared for their most ambitious project yet. After a year of learning to combine their abilities, they were ready to attempt something Elizabeth had only theorized about in her final research notes, a complete harmonic synthesis that would allow them to share their unique perspectives with the world. Sarah coordinated from her central position, her wheelchair surrounded by holographic displays showing the status of every sanctuary facility worldwide. The twins, Hana and Yuki, had developed new techniques for translating different types of patterns into forms that anyone could perceive, while Maya's temporal sensitivity helped them understand how these patterns flowed and evolved through time. "Everything's connected," Sarah explained to a group of visiting scientists who had come to observe their work. "The patterns we see in music, mathematics, nature, time, they're all part of the same symphony. We're just learning to hear it." Clearly, for the first time, Alexander stood with Claire and Mrs. Henderson, watching as the children prepared for their demonstration. The facility's responsive architecture seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the very walls understood the significance of what they were about to attempt. "Elizabeth's final research suggested this was possible," Claire said, reviewing notes on her tablet. "She believed that when enough children learned to harmonize their abilities, they could create a way for others to experience the world as they do, even if only temporarily." Mrs. Henderson smiled softly. "She always said that understanding comes in patterns. First one person sees something new, then another, until suddenly everyone can recognize what was there all along." The facility's AI system began the countdown. Sequences children in sanctuaries around the world synchronized their efforts. The patterns they had learned to perceive and manipulate, visual, auditory, mathematical, temporal, all began to flow together in perfect harmony. "Ready?" Sarah asked, looking around at her fellow pattern seers. The other children nodded, their hands moving to their control stations with practiced confidence. The main chamber filled with extraordinary displays of light and sound as the children began their harmonic synthesis. Through their combined abilities, they created patterns that could be perceived even by those without their special gifts, windows into their unique way of seeing the world. The visiting scientists gasped as the patterns took shape around them. For the first time, they could see what the children saw, the intricate web of connections that linked all things, the beautiful complexity of reality that usually remained hidden from ordinary perception. "This is incredible," one of the scientists whispered, watching as mathematical sequences danced with sound waves, while temporal flows merged with crystal structures in ways that defied conventional understanding. Sarah guided the experience with natural grace, helping the observers understand what they were seeing. "Every pattern tells a story," she explained. "When you learn to read them together, they reveal truths about the world that we're only beginning to understand." Through the facility's light wells, the afternoon sun created its own patterns that seemed to dance in harmony with the children's demonstration. The sanctuary had become more than just a safe haven or a school. It was a bridge between different ways of perceiving and understanding reality. Alexander moved to stand beside his daughter, watching as she coordinated this extraordinary sharing of perception. In her focused expression, he saw the fulfillment of everything Elizabeth had worked for, not just protecting these special children, but helping them become teachers and guides for a new way of understanding the world. "Your mother knew this day would come," he said softly. "She built the sanctuary not just as a refuge, but as a foundation for something greater, a way to help everyone see the extraordinary patterns that shape our world." As the demonstration concluded, the scientists were visibly moved by what they had experienced. The children's ability to share their unique perspective had opened doors of understanding that would have profound implications for fields ranging from physics to psychology. The facility's systems hummed with satisfied energy as the children concluded their harmonic synthesis. Reports from other sanctuaries showed similar successful demonstrations worldwide, creating a network of understanding that transcended traditional boundaries of perception and communication. "This is just the beginning," Sarah said, her eyes bright with purpose. "Mom gave us the tools we needed, but what we build with them, that's up to all of us now." Through the windows, the setting sun painted the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than ever before, as if the world itself was celebrating this new chapter in human understanding. The sanctuary had fulfilled its original purpose and grown into something even more extraordinary, a gateway to perceiving and understanding the countless patterns that make up reality itself. As the day drew to a close, Alexander watched. His daughter began planning their next project with her fellow pattern seers. The future they were creating together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. 18 months after the sanctuary's activation, the facility had grown into something far beyond its original purpose as a refuge. The children's abilities had evolved in ways that even Elizabeth hadn't fully anticipated, creating new possibilities for human understanding and perception. The resonance hall hummed with activity as Sarah coordinated what they now called the bridge sessions, special demonstrations where children from all sanctuaries worldwide worked together to share their unique perspectives with scientists, educators, and other visitors. "Every pattern tells a story," Sarah explained to a group of wide-eyed observers. "When we learn to see them together, they reveal connections that have always existed but remained hidden from most people's perception." The twins, Hana and Yuki, had developed new techniques for translating complex harmonics into forms that anyone could understand. Their work had led to breakthroughs in fields ranging from quantum physics to environmental science, as they helped others perceive the intricate patterns that governed natural phenomena. Alexander watched from his usual spot near the observation window, marveling at how far they'd come. The facility's responsive architecture had evolved alongside the children's abilities, creating an environment that seemed to breathe and pulse with shared purpose. Elizabeth's final research notes predicted something like this, Claire said, joining him at the window. But even she couldn't have imagined how beautifully it would all come together. Mrs. Henderson approached with a tablet displaying the latest global network status. "The new sanctuary in Auckland just came online," she reported. "That makes 28 facilities worldwide, all working in harmony. The main chamber filled with swirling patterns of light and energy as the children began their demonstration. Through their combined abilities, they created windows into their unique way of seeing the world, revealing the mathematical beauty of a flower's growth, the harmonic patterns in weather systems, the subtle rhythms that connected all living things. "Look at this," Maya called from her station, her temporal sensitivity revealing new layers of understanding. When we map the flow of discoveries across all sanctuaries, it creates a pattern that matches the one in Mum's final message. Sarah wheeled over to examine Maya's findings, her hands moving through the holographic display with practiced ease. "She knew," she said softly. "She knew that when we learned to work together, we'd start seeing connections she could only theorize about." The facility's AI system chimed, announcing the arrival of another time-locked message from Elizabeth. These had become rare treasures, each one revealing new aspects of her vision for humanity's future. The message manifested as a complex harmonic pattern that the children had learned to read as easily as others read books. Through their combined perception, they understood what Elizabeth was showing them, a glimpse of possibilities that lay ahead if they continued to develop their abilities together. "Your mother built the sanctuary as a beginning," Alexander said to Sarah, watching as she guided younger children through their first experiences of pattern synthesis. "But what you and the others have created here goes beyond anything she could have planned." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. "That's what she wanted. She gave us the foundation, but she knew we'd have to discover our own way forward." Through the facility's light wells, the afternoon sun created patterns that seemed to dance in harmony with the children's work. The sanctuary had become more than just a school or research center. It was a bridge between different ways of seeing and understanding reality itself. The visiting scientists watched in amazement as the children demonstrated their latest breakthrough, a way to share not just their perceptions, but the actual experience of seeing patterns as they did. For brief moments, others could glimpse the world through their eyes, understanding the profound interconnectedness of all things. "This is what Mom meant about evolution," Sarah explained to her father later, as they reviewed the day's achievements. "It's not just about individual abilities. It's about learning to combine our different perspectives to see the bigger picture." The facility's systems hummed with satisfied energy as children in sanctuaries across the world continued their harmonious work. Each discovery led to new questions. Each breakthrough opened doors to further understanding. As the day drew to a close, Alexander watched his daughter begin planning their next project with her fellow pattern seers. In her determined expression, he saw echoes of both Elizabeth's visionary brilliance and James's intuitive understanding. "They would be so proud of you," he said softly. Sarah smiled, her hand finding his. "They're still with us," she said. "In every pattern we discover, in every connection we make. Their love left its own kind of pattern, one that keeps growing stronger as we learn to see it more clearly." Through the windows, the setting sun painted the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than ever before, as if the world itself was celebrating how far they'd come. The sanctuary had become exactly what Elizabeth had hoped, not just a safe haven, but a gateway to understanding the countless patterns that made up reality itself. The future they were creating together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. On the second anniversary of the sanctuary's activation, the facility prepared for its most significant moment yet. Children from every sanctuary worldwide had gathered, their combined abilities ready to attempt something Elizabeth had only dreamed of, a complete harmonic synthesis that would permanently bridge the gap between different ways of perceiving reality. The resonance hall had been transformed, its responsive architecture humming with anticipation as Sarah coordinated the final preparations. Her wheelchair moved smoothly between stations where children from different facilities worked, together, each contributing their unique perspective to the growing harmony. "Every pattern we've discovered," Sarah explained to the assembled observers, "every connection we've made has been leading us to this moment. Today, we're not just sharing our perspective, we're helping to expand humanity's understanding of what's possible." Alexander stood with Claire and Mrs. Henderson, watching as the children prepared for their demonstration. The facility's systems pulsed with energy, responding to the unprecedented combination of abilities being brought together. "Elizabeth's final research predicted this," Claire said softly, reviewing the last notes they'd uncovered. She called the eternal pattern, a state where different perceptions of reality could merge permanently, creating a new way of understanding the world. The twins, Hana and Yuki, had developed a revolutionary method for stabilizing the harmonic fields that made their demonstrations possible. Maya's temporal sensitivity helped them understand how these patterns could be maintained across time, while other children contributed their own unique insights to the complex web of perception they were creating. As the children began their work, the main chamber filled with extraordinary displays of light and sound, but this time something was different. The patterns they created didn't fade when the demonstration ended. They became part of reality itself, visible to anyone who knew how to look for them. Mom always said that understanding comes in patterns, Sarah said, coordinating the complex harmonies. First one person sees something new, then another, until suddenly everyone can recognize what was always there. The facility's AI system chimed, announcing the arrival of Elizabeth's final time-locked message. As it played, the pattern it created merged seamlessly with the children's work, completing a circle that had begun years ago with James's first drawings. "My darlings," Elizabeth's voice emerged from the harmony, "if you're seeing this, then you've discovered what I always hoped you would, that your unique ways of perceiving the world aren't limitations, but gifts that can help all of humanity see more clearly." Through their combined abilities, the children created something extraordinary, a permanent bridge between different ways of seeing and understanding reality. The patterns they revealed became part of the world itself, accessible to anyone willing to learn how to perceive them. Alexander moved to stand beside his daughter, watching as she guided this transformation with natural grace. In her focused expression, he saw the fulfillment of everything Elizabeth had worked for, not just protecting these special children, but helping them become teachers and guides for a new chapter in human understanding. "Your mother knew this day would come," he said softly. "She built the sanctuary not just as a refuge, but as a foundation for something greater, a way to help everyone see the extraordinary patterns that shape our world." As the demonstration reached its peak, the facility's light wells seemed to glow with new energy, the afternoon sun creating patterns that everyone could now perceive. The sanctuary had fulfilled its original purpose and grown into something even more extraordinary, a gateway to a new way of seeing and understanding reality itself. The visiting scientists and observers watched in amazement as their own perception expanded, allowing them to glimpse the intricate web of connections that the children had always been able to see. It wasn't just a temporary experience this time. It was a permanent evolution in human consciousness. "This is what Mom meant about the future," Sarah said, her eyes bright with purpose. "Not just protecting those who see things differently, but helping everyone understand that there are countless ways to perceive and understand the world." Through the windows, the setting sun painted the sky in colors that seemed more vibrant than ever before, as if the universe itself was celebrating this new chapter in human understanding. The patterns that James had first seen, that Elizabeth had protected, and that Sarah and the others had helped reveal, were now a permanent part of human perception. As the day drew to a close, Alexander watched his daughter begin planning the next phase of their work with her fellow pattern seers. The future they had created together was both wonderful and entirely unexpected, just as Elizabeth had planned all along. And somewhere in the complex harmonies and intricate patterns they had revealed, he felt the presence of his entire family: Elizabeth's brilliant foresight, James's profound insight, and Sarah's natural ability to bring people together, all combining to create something truly extraordinary. The sanctuary had become more than just a safe haven or a school. It was a bridge to a future where different ways of seeing the world weren't just accepted, but celebrated. A future where the patterns that connected all things were visible to everyone who took the time to look for them. Sarah looked up at her father, her expression full of joy and purpose. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning of a whole new way of seeing things." Alexander smiled, knowing she was right. The pattern they had helped reveal would continue to grow and evolve, just as Elizabeth had always believed it would. It was their legacy, a gift of perception that would benefit generations to come. The eternal pattern had been revealed, and the world would never be quite the same again.